Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. A number of you actually asked me to cover a specific topic that's been raging around the internet for the past couple of days, thanks to an interview with one of the engineers over at Microsoft, where they were basically commenting on the nature of how the Xbox Series X clock frequencies differ in their handling versus the PlayStation 5. Basically, we are referring to the fixed frequency of the Xbox versus the way the PlayStation 5 deals with things, which it's not quite a variable frequency. Instead, it's a flexible frequency. Now, I'm going to read out the quote first, and then we're going to go on with the actual analysis. Jason Ronald had an interview with Xcarta, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, .com. It is in Spanish, although you can use Google Translate pretty effectively on the website. And Jason Ronald is one of the engineers over at Microsoft, working once again on the Xbox. Now, he said that we could have used force clocks or variable clock rates. The reality is that it makes it harder for developers to optimize their gains, even though it would have allowed us to boast higher T-flops than we already had. Of course, real quick, the Xbox has 52 active compute units out of 56 on the die, and it's running at 1825 MHz. The PlayStation 5, meanwhile, has 36 active compute units out of 40 compute units on the die, and runs up to 2230. But it is imperative for us to realise that the clock frequencies themselves are not unpredictable. And I have discussed this a couple of times on the channel before. In fact, I put out a fairly lengthy video detailing the different approaches both Sony and Microsoft had for their respective systems. Long story short, it's not that Sony or Microsoft had a wrong take with their console, but the systems are designed actually fundamentally to be rather different from one another. And it's a pretty poor analogy, but you can kind of think of it like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, although the capabilities of the systems are much more closely aligned compared to the PS3 and the 360. For example, with the PS3, it had a significantly more powerful CPU, but the GPU was not programmable and anywhere near as flexible. It didn't have a unified memory architecture and so on. But the two consoles were fundamentally designed to be rather different from one another, and, well, honestly, the PS3 ended up being rather difficult to develop for numerous reasons, with the GPU decision being rather late in the cycle. But we'll maybe discuss that another time. Back in, well, a couple of years ago now, I did actually put out a video detailing the cell processor for the PS3. Anyway, getting back onto the topic here. The frequencies of the PlayStation 5 are not dictated by heat, because that would be a variable which would be constrained based on the region of the world you're living in, or whether it's the summer or winter months. In the UK, for example, it's currently summer as of the time I'm recording this video, and we don't often have air conditioning in our homes, which is kind of weird given the fact that we can get like 90 to even 100 degrees sometimes in our houses. And this, of course, means that you would have a console which would be like up there with clock frequency, and then during the winter months, it would go like, into the stratosphere. I just realised my hand was totally in the wrong position for the camera, but you get my point. So instead of actually working on the heat and the temperature of the die, it instead relies on power. And basically, depending on the workload, the power will shift around the die, and it's done so very, very, very quickly. This is not a case of it takes, 2 seconds for the clock frequency to ramp up to 2230 on the GPU, and then another 3 or 4 seconds it's running at, at 2150 while the CPU runs higher. Instead, this is based on AMD's SmartShift technology. According to official comments from AMD, Smart Shift can occur within 2 milliseconds. However, previously I'd released some information that one of my sources had given me that within the target frame rate of 120 FPS of a PSVR game. Smart Shift could adjust frequencies multiple times within that frame, and rather interestingly, I'm even hearing that the APU is not just dictated in terms of power via the CPU and GPU, but even potentially the Tempest engine as well can give up some of its power budget to either the CPU or GPU, depending what's going on with the particular scene, and most of this is automated. To my understanding, also speaking to developers, as well as a couple of other people behind the scenes, one of the reasons that Sony took this approach was actually requests and interactions with developers. For example, do you remember back in the day when Assassin's Creed Unity launched, Ubisoft actually were thinking that Assassin's Creed Unity would have a lot more CPU power than what it ended up actually having, and ultimately it meant that large crowds would really hammer the frame rate. I've discussed this a couple of times in the past, and also did some frame rate testing. With that said though, do I think that Jason is incorrect? Well, I think it will depend on the workload. Both systems, as I mentioned a few moments ago, have rather different approaches in their design. The PlayStation 5 focuses on getting data through the system as quickly as possible. So, while it does have fewer compute units, which A means lower T-flops, and B means even fewer ray tracing cores, for example, and also fewer texture mapping units because there's 4 TMU per CU, just for your FYI, it does mean that certain things such as alpha effects can actually be potentially done faster on the PlayStation 5, and also geometry too, in some instances, can be rendered faster on the PS5 hardware. And this is not even taking things like the SSD into account. With that said though, the Xbox approach also has benefits. With the wider design, you have higher numbers of compute units which you could use in parallel. To my understanding, that is harder for developers to fully leverage, but by gosh, if you do fully leverage it, the results are pretty startling. And while the number of compute units for the Xbox Series X is higher, this translates into, for example, more rays which can be calculated in a scene, even though those rays technically, I'm talking about ray tracing here, technically can bounce theoretically to fewer surfaces because the clock frequency is running slower. And there is a lot more about this that I've covered in the past. For example, the higher clock frequency of the PS5 also means that the GPU runs faster, whereas on the other hand, the Xbox Series X has a higher clock frequency for its CPU, which naturally in turn means that it's going to have some benefits. And basically, what I'm trying to say is that the next generation is extremely interesting. Does that mean that I'm throwing Ronald under the bus and that I'm calling him out and saying that he's just trying to criticize the PlayStation? No. Ultimately, a team will naturally push their design. And honestly, Sony kind of did the same thing for the Road to PS5 event as well. He took a theoretical GPU which had 48 compute units and was running at 750 megahertz, and then compared that against a theoretical PS5 GPU which had 36 compute units, albeit only running at 1 gigahertz, and pointed out that while the number of T-flops is identical, the wider design does mean that it's harder to fully utilize the GPU, which is true, and the higher clock frequency once again means that you have other benefits. Frankly speaking, I think both consoles are designed extremely well. But, going into the next gen, I think it's going to not just be raw performance of the hardware, but also down to the developers too. And it's going to be interesting to me which platform takes the lead in terms of like what platform AAA developers decide to just use as the flagship. Obviously with this generation it was the PS4. With the last generation it was quite frequently the 360, and some of the ports on the PS3 were, well, let's just say not good, especially in the early part of the life of the system. And this is simply because the PS3's cell processor was not being fully used, with only the CPU core being utilised and the SPEs just not being utilised, well, basically by developers at all at the start. And some of this was down to development tools as well. So, long story short, what do I make of this? Nothing really. It's not actually technically accurate on how the PlayStation 5 works. You can do your own due diligence on this if you would like. You can listen to Mark Cerny at the Road to PS5 event. And it's also worth noting that power, it does not have a linear relationship to clock frequency. If you're a PC overclocker, you'll know this pretty well. You can have a CPU which has a vid of let's just make it simple to say default voltage of, let's say, 1.2 volts to hit, let's say, 4.7 gigahertz on course. Then you might need 1.21 to hit, let's say, 5 gigahertz. But if you want to hit 5.1, well, you better have a nuclear power station just for you, because your voltage may need to be going up to like 1.25 volts. According to Cerny, a 10% drop in power will just result in a few percent drop to clock frequency, and given what we've seen with RDNA and even the Turing architecture from NVIDIA, and how voltages, well, don't really necessarily translate to drastic clock frequency differences, once again you can Google this yourself, I am inclined to believe him. With that said, both consoles do have distinct advantages going into the next generation. And one advantage I would like to discuss from Microsoft's perspective is another update. I don't know how many updates I'm going to have for Lockhart following one another. And this time it's again from Tom Warren, but concerns the actual resolution and target frame rate of the machine. According to Tom, the machine is going to be 1440p capable, but in doing so developers will need to target just 30 FPS. 1080p meanwhile is achievable at 60 FPS. Now, to me, this makes sense given the rumoured target performance of the machine, around 4 T-flops, although we don't know the exact configuration of the GPU, and also the fact that the CPU is identical, according to Tom, compared to the Xbox Series X. And I think that this would make an excellent cheap entry-level system into the ecosystem of Microsoft. Because let's say, for example, you do want to buy a PlayStation 5, but you don't own a gaming PC. Purchasing Lockhart to play some of the Microsoft exclusives makes sense, especially given Game Pass is such great value. And I really am very convinced at this point that Sony and Microsoft have some incredible games that they are working on. I have actually heard of a few titles which I'm not allowed to say, but if they are true, and I'm pretty certain they are true, let's just say that both consoles will be extremely compelling. But then again, Microsoft know that a lot of folks will not want to plonk down, let's say, $450, $500 on a system, so purchasing Lockhart might be an excellent option. But I do have a couple of questions though, some queries if you will, regarding the resolution question and frame rate. What if developers choose to AI upsample from a lower resolution? How achievable is this? To our understanding, this is done on the compute units of the GPU, compared to, let's say, NVIDIA's DLSS solution. So, for example, could we have a 1080p base resolution and then upsample to 1440p? Or could we have the internal resolution be, I don't know, 900p and then upsample to 1080p, and so on and so on? I realise that Lockhart has received some criticism because people don't feel that it's a truly next-gen machine, but it does sport features like hardware-based ray tracing still, to my knowledge. It's still using the RDNA2 based architecture. And to my knowledge, there's no real major drawback for developers targeting Lockhart as well as the Series X. It really should not be that difficult and tricky to create code for both systems, especially given most developers now are going to be creating PC ports anyway. And let's face it, while a lot of folks will have I guess in a year's time, an RTX 3080 Ti or an RX 6900 XT or whatever. There are also going to be a number of people who are still rocking a GTX 1060. So you will need to craft experiences which are going to be scalable on hardware anyway. But for the Xbox, it's still going to have an SSD, it's still going to have the same clock frequency on the CPU, it's still going to have high bandwidth. The differences in the GPU are going to be more around the actual performance of the hardware rather than the feature set. So I don't think it's going to be that difficult to be like, oh, okay, well, we're going to crank down the internal rendered resolution, which is naturally going to affect not only the workload the GPU is handling in like geometry and stuff like that, but also we can reduce the texture quality because of the same reasons, blah, 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 blah. Compute effects can be rendered in internal resolutions that are lower as well, yada, yada, yada. And it should free up quite a lot of GPU resources rather quickly here. Anyway, I'm going to be very fascinated to see how the next gen does unfold, but for now, I'm going to let you all go. So take care of yourselves, have an amazing day, bye for now.